I started writing and being interested in researching about crack and the war on drugs after I finished a book on the Black Panther Party. And this grew out of an interest of trying to understand the period after the civil rights and the Black Power movement in the 1970s and 1980s. And I think this period is incredibly important because it's really the building of what we call mass incarceration. It begins in the early 70s and then begins to accelerate. And the war on drugs played a seminal role in it, both the first war on drugs under Nixon and then especially the so-called second war on drugs under Ronald Reagan. But it became a kind of structure of punishment that each president, starting with actually a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson in 1965, and then Richard Nixon, and then really Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. And the single biggest period of incarceration in the United States at the state and federal level was actually under Bill Clinton in the 1990s. So I think that when we're looking at the contemporary problems today, understanding the mass protests that we had in Ferguson and Charlotte and other cities across the country, none of that can be understood without looking at the state punishment apparatus. The reason I also am studying crack is that the crack crisis or the crack epidemic was the primary rationale for the war on drugs. So one of the things I remember having come of age during this period is that no one was talking about the war on drugs. Everyone was talking about crack. So it's impossible to write about one without writing about another. The second reason is that crack itself, the cocaine economy that grew out of the anti-communist wars in Central America, which led to the vast expansion of this illicit selling of cocaine in the United States, this wrought destruction within all different kinds of communities. African American communities, but many other communities were using crack as well. Although you didn't see the rhetoric of race in the same way you did with African Americans, according to the National Institute for Drug Abuse, 2/3 of crack users were white. And thinking about how this is linked to our contemporary moment, there's a lot of discussion about the opioid crisis. And it's obvious the contrast in the kinds of sympathetic ways that opioid users are represented. You know, white communities, white victims, public health, seekers versus illicit users of moral failing. That contrast is clear. But I also think that in some ways, as we look at what's going on with these communities in the opioid crisis, it's important to go back to that archive of what happened in the crack era. Families being torn asunder, children being sacrificed to foster care, long-term criminalization. The war on drugs continues even during the opioid crisis. So I think it's important both to understand mass incarceration, but also to interpret the drug crises of today.